I was able to find letters from families in central Germany that were trying to get to Alaska and were portraying themselves as great potential pioneers. And they had seen this report and were naive about the politics behind it and didn't appreciate the levels of anti-Semitism and practical concerns as well. And these families were full of hope, and they all disappeared in the Holocaust. They never got out. Then it was exciting to be able to also tell the story of Josie Rudolph, this pioneer daughter, and how, as a U.S. citizen, her Alaska plan worked.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is writer Tom Kizzia, whose 8-part series on the first white settler girl born in American Alaska concludes today in the Anchorage Daily News. Josie's story tells of the life of Josie Rudolph, who was born in Sitka in 1869 to German Jewish parents, but moved back to Germany when she was still a child. Over 60 years later, in Nuremberg, it was Josie's Alaskan birth which saved her from the Nazis. Tom Kizzia had a 25-year career as a reporter for the Anchorage Daily News. He is the author of 3 books, Cold Mountain Path, Pilgrim's Wilderness, and The Wake of the Unseen Object. This is Tom Kizzia's 3rd appearance on this podcast. Check out the previous episodes to learn more about his life story and take deep dives into all 3 of his books. Tom Kizzia, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be back.
I want to start just going back to you're visiting friends in New Jersey, you're having dinner. Just tell us the discovery of the story.
It was just a dinner conversation, and it was some years ago now with some high school friends. And one of my friends' wives said, "Oh, you're from Alaska. My great-grandmother was born in Alaska." And I said, "Oh, really?" And I'm thinking, great-grandmother, that's how many generations ago is that? And one of the things that's amazing about Alaska as a writer and historian working here is how close to the surface history is, and the first encounters with indigenous people and all. It's just a little bit beyond recent memory. That was what I found in writing Cold Mountain Path about the ghost town history of McCarthy. Everything was just beyond my fingertips or even within reach. And I thought, great-grandmother, how long ago was that? And she answered it for me and said, "Oh, she was the first girl baby born in Sitka after America bought Alaska from Russia." And I thought, wow, could that really be true? And then she said, yeah, and because she was born on U.S. soil, she was saved from the Holocaust. And I was staggered, but skeptical too. But when I came back, I just couldn't stop thinking about that. If that was true, it was an amazing story, and one that obviously no one had ever written about or knew about except for the family. And so I started digging into the records, and it took a long time. It took a few years, actually, of half-hearted poking around in the records to find out if it could possibly be true, because I had used the U.S. Census when I was doing the writing about McCarthy. I found the U.S. Census was a great tool. You're like talking about an old timer, and you say you want to know, well, like, how old was he and where was he born? And people say, I don't know. I just knew him. And they tell you the good stories that they knew, but this kind of factual background wasn't there. But you could actually go to the 1940 or 1930 census, and there the person is and living in McCarthy, and it's got all this information. So I went to the 1870 census right after Sitka became part of the United States, and was disappointed to see that they hadn't included the Alaska district in that census. And so I thought, well, dead end. And then one of the archivists at the State Historical Library in Juneau eventually got in touch and said, there was this Army report that had a census in it. And when I went to that, there she was as a 19-month-old baby in 1870. And I took off from that point and got more serious about trying to fill out the story.
Was that the moment when you realized, okay, now I can prove that this person existed in Sitka in that year? And that's when you were like, now I'm going to do this?
Yeah. Now that I knew I would go forward with it, but how far I was going to go with it, I didn't know. Just like with Cold Mountain Path, that was going to be a month project that turned into a few years just because it kept getting better. And this story did as well. It just seemed to raise so many interesting themes that played into the present day and then finding some of the good primary sources about Sitka, chance to bring to life a story about modern Alaska's birth.
If you think about who would be the first settler girl born in Alaska, you wouldn't think that it would be a German Jewish baby. It causes you to really think about who were the first white people in Alaska. I want to go back to the Army census because it had all of those interesting descriptors of all the different people where he wrote little notes about the rascals and drunkards. And obviously that's not in our current census today.
Yeah, I wish it were. As a writer, that's a wonderful, if scandalous and probably libelous tool, but it was fun to look at and gave you a picture, I think, of the community, but it also gave you a picture of the person who was doing the census itself. The prejudices of the times came through in the attitudes toward the mixed race people in the community there, and the fact that he handled the white settlers with kid gloves more. But then it was interesting to see how they would address the Jewish population, which was mostly, it looked like immigrant population, even though like the Rudolphs, Josie's parents had been in the United States for several decades, but still most of the Jewish families who came up to Sitka had come to the United States from Eastern and Middle Europe.
How often do you, as a journalist, have these leads that don't pan out? You probably have way more examples of these that go nowhere.
Yeah, that does happen a lot. And now that I'm not working as a full-time reporter, I can delve into them a little more. When you're working as a reporter, you get these great tips and you're batting them away left and right because they come pretty fast in that profession. You have to learn to not bat them away too quickly and wait and see. And I think the backdrop of all of this is the Anchorage Daily News has always been a kind of off-the-wall newspaper, which is what I've liked so much about being associated with it through the years, willing to do something weird and different without a lot of persuasion. We've just had a really good relationship through the years, and they were open to doing this kind of a project, which is pretty unconventional for most newspapers because the news angle, what's the news angle in this? I think I figured out what the news angle is, but it wasn't obvious going in.
You first mentioned the project thinking that it would be published in April. So I know that you've had this in your hands for a while. But obviously today, the day we're releasing this is the day that part 8 is appearing in the paper. Why didn't we publish in April? Do you know?
I think it's just a big reach for the small newspaper. There are only a few editors around these days, and the newsroom is small and the news hole is small, and things have been changing. On the time that they had the draft in hand, they stopped printing 4 days out of the week as a print paper, but they're still doing that facsimile paper. And there were questions about, do we lay this out within the facsimile paper and the print paper, or do we just run it online separately? And I think there was a lot of internal discussion, but really they're just strapped day to day trying to keep up with the fire hose of news that comes through with that small newsroom. And I think they had to take a really deep breath before they could jump in and do the editing and work that was necessary to pry open the space and get this together. So I was sympathetic throughout, but frustrated that we'd come close. I think we can do it next week. Oh, no, something's come up. Well, let's wait. And I knew that if we didn't get it in before the election, then there's going to be lots of news following the election. That would be even a longer horizon. And so I'm glad we finally got it in here.
talking about the timing of this release. The great-granddaughter was wondering from the very beginning, because she was an anthropologist, if there would be an appetite for talking about the first female settler baby born in American Alaska, given the greater context in which we view our colonial settler history and the fact that Alaska Natives were displaced and mistreated during this time period. And we're actually recording this on October 26th, 162 years after the bombardment of Yangon. And I believe the apology is happening today from the Navy to Yangon. I was just reading the AP report from last night. You did a great job of incorporating Alaska Native perspective and reminding about what the Alaska Native history and experience was during this period. But I think if you wrote this 30 years ago, it might have been a different framing.
I think for me, it wouldn't have been a different framing because this is the way I came to Alaska, looking at Alaska history and the impacts on indigenous people. I think when my first book was The Wake of the Unseen Object was about travels in the bush in the 1980s. And it had enough of that sense of a world imposing itself on the indigenous world. That was the principal theme in a way. And so the book has been able to stay alive and not feel dated in that way. And I think I would have probably written this the same way, but it might have been received as a more of a radical departure 30 years ago, rather than the way it is today, where in some ways now I'm pushing in the other direction against the settler colonial narrative as a kind of meta narrative that has created a mental shortcut toward understanding the complexities of Alaska history. But I hope that people would enter into this story wondering, where is he coming down on Tlingit land claims? And by the compelling facts as they unfold, will be brought around to understanding how blatant the theft of lands was at the time. And clearly, I'm not trying to follow up and describe the whole subsequent history of efforts to compensate for that. But it was great that Susie, one of the two cousins I worked with, raised that as a question to me, because that first episode was a chance for me to respond to her in conversation that more dramatized the issue for my purposes. When I was writing this for a long time, my working title was Pioneer Daughter. It ended up with a more sort of anodyne Josie's story. Some of the editors at the paper felt that using the term pioneer would put people off. And I was saying earlier, what's the news value in all of this as a newspaper? I think the news value for a lot of readers in the general public is, what do you mean pioneer is not a favorable term? For so long, the virtue of the settlement of Alaska was the sort of the virtuous pioneers who came here and sacrificed a lot for their dreams, et cetera, et cetera. And some of that is true, but it ignored what they were pushing aside and taking over and taking away from. And modern history is much more complicated, and it's a good thing that it is. And so part of this project was an attempt to illustrate how complicated things have gotten, but you wanted to keep the sort of old perspective in there as well as to raise the new. It hasn't quite come to the point where anybody has proposed to change the name of the pioneer's home to the colonial settler's home. But I think that it's in the air, and talking about that is probably a little risky from the most militant point of view. Looking at my series, it maybe doesn't go far enough in that it's not all oriented around this sort of theft and assimilation. But on the other hand, I was trying to write to the general public who maybe isn't even aware of this modern thinking about the settlement of Alaska, and trying to educate them about this is why we feel that way about it. And all this is, of course, going on in the background of Josie and her family, who are just a part of this movement, but not in the vanguard by any means. There are other characters who I do bring in there like William Seward and William Dodge, the first elected official in Alaska, who are great characters in themselves and represent really more the settler colonial spirit.
Right. I want to just put one more plug in about the apologies at Cake and at Angoon. The AP report for the apology happening today in Angoon, this one paragraph: shells fell on the Alaska Native village as winter approached, and then sailors landed and burned what was left of homes, food caches, and canoes. Conditions grew so dire in the following months that elders sacrificed their own lives to spare food for surviving children. It was October 26, 1882, in Angoon, a village of 420 people. Now, 142 years later, the perpetrator of the bombardment, the U.S. Navy, is set to say it's sorry. It just paints that picture of raising the villages. And it wasn't like this casual displacement.
It was a displacement of the Tlingit legal system by the American one, too, apart from the attack on the people themselves. It was a clash of who's in charge here from the individual village, and that, so I think, established that fear-based hegemony. But that, of course, came after the period I wrote about, right. But it was the same continuum.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering about primary sources. Obviously, you had the Army census that had those wonderful details about the folks who were currently living there. But I don't know, the Rudolf Glanz book, The Jews in Alaska, 1867 to 1880, did you have an actual copy of that book?
Eventually I did. I didn't really when I started. And I think he, in his effort, had dug into the same primary sources that I had dug into, so that by the time I saw his book, I already knew a lot of that about the particular families. It would have been a great help if I'd had that right at the beginning. But then I might not have been tempted to go into the records myself. He was an amateur historian, and it's a self-published tract that he wrote.
I'll just go out on a limb and say that is a very niche audience of who's the buyer for that particular book, The Jews in Alaska.
He wasn't an Alaskan. He was just interested in that. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that you included William Seward. I love that you really gave a historical context for things happening throughout the country, happening in Alaska at that time period. I think one of the frustrations I had a few times is that I wanted to know more what was specifically happening in Josie's family, and having a little bit of frustration that we don't know exactly, that their own family doesn't know. But then I think about my own family. If you ask me to name all my great-grandparents, I actually can't name all of them, much less tell you anything. So I think in that regard, I've got to have some grace for the fact that we don't have many specific stories about the Rudolph family in Sitka in 1869, because I have zero stories about my family in 1869.
Yeah, I think that's why this is a newspaper series and not a book, is I don't have the internal life of the Rudolphs to work through. And I don't believe in projecting very much into that. We do know why they went back to Germany, but why they came up to Alaska and back, you could pretty much surmise. They saw opportunities. Martin Rudolph was involved in all manner of operations, including, as we find out at the very end, the bootlegging.
Whiskey inside beer kegs.
Like just about everyone else in that white community. That was the only industry that really paid in Alaska, was working in booze in one way or another. He ran a brewery, which was legal, and there were a couple of breweries in Sitka. But even the first governor of Alaska was busted for bootlegging in that period.
There's a long history of elected officials doing things with alcohol that they publicly wouldn't admit to.
Yeah, and of course it's different in Indian territory, as they were calling it, trade with the native people. And that was seen by the reformers as one of the main problems afflicted the district. But it was also, like I said, the only actual industry up here once they had finished selling off the Russian assets. And there really wasn't any fur trading going on out of Sitka anymore. It was channeling through Sitka from the Pribilovs in the later years of the Russian operation. And when the Alaska Commercial Company took over those operations. They just went straight up to the Pribilofs and weren't really interested in taking any of the assets out of Sitka.
I wanted to talk a little bit about Josie not having a birth certificate and that being one issue. And then there's some American law that I just wasn't familiar with. The 1907 law that removes citizenship from American women who married foreign men. And
that was so strange. That was there's been some great scholarship on that, and I read a lot about it and really wanted to write a lot about it, but it was a big rabbit trail when I tried to incorporate it into the story. I didn't
I'm glad you did.
I mentioned it in a couple of paragraphs, but
when she moved back to Germany and grew up in Germany, she married a German man. And therefore, an American woman marrying a German man, she loses her American citizenship.
Yeah. And I don't think she had any proof of her citizenship to begin with and didn't necessarily worry about that at the time, not anticipating that she was going to have to flee. But even if she had been able to establish her birthright citizenship until 1936, when Congress repealed that earlier law, she wouldn't have been able to claim it. Even as under the 14th Amendment, she couldn't have been a U.S. citizen because she had lost it through this other means. In her application for citizenship, which the family has on the sort of onion skin carbon copy, it's very explicitly under the law such and such passed by Congress in 1936, I hereby apply for citizenship. Even in 1936, I guess her husband died in January, and this law didn't pass until June. And for that period, she couldn't have even applied successfully to get her citizenship because she could have been rejected on those grounds, on the grounds of that 1907 law. Bizarre.
Right.
A man could marry a foreign national.
Not only could a man marry a foreign national, but didn't his wife become an American citizen? So it was like working doubly well for men and doubly bad for women. That was really quite unfair. Now, explain to me again, her mother, Josie's mother, had a sworn affidavit that her daughter had been born in Alaska. That was the only proof that she had.
Yeah, the famous German bureaucracy wanted to have all the paperwork done when she married Bernhard Thurnauer as a 19-year-old. She had to fill out who she was. This is in 1888, who she was and when she was born and all. And so they had an affidavit from her mother attesting to her birth in this American colony of Alaska. And in her application to the U.S. Embassy, that was what was cited as evidence. And furthermore, saying there's no other record available, whether that meant they didn't have any access to the record, which clearly from Europe during the growing pre-war period, it would have been hard to reach out and get evidence anyway. But I don't believe there was any evidence actually in existence in Sitka other than, as I found eventually, that military census, which listed her birthplace as Sitka, and then the newspaper article saying the wife of M. Rudolph just had a baby. That was the only actual evidence, but they didn't have that in Germany. So they cited this affidavit that her mother had filled out. Again, the reason the family had to go back was Fanny was Josie's mother. Fanny's family had illness back in Bavaria, and we do know this from a family letter. And so they went back to help with the family on a short-term basis. And then one thing led to another. Martin Rudolph, her father, died while they were in Germany, and she just decided to stay there and raise Josie as a single mom, as a widow, and not make the return to America where her sister had stayed in Oregon. And so it wasn't until 1907 that Josie herself came to visit her aunt in Oregon and made a return trip to America. Yeah, so they hadn't really planned to raise Josie in Germany, but that's the way it worked out.
I want to flash forward a little bit. So basically, Josie lived in Nuremberg. That's where she raised her two kids and where she was until she had to flee the country. Her son got arrested and thrown in prison. And that's a really great part of your series. I just have to say, like, his positive attitude and it's all going to be fine. Did you have to go to Germany to do, how did you get that stuff?
I got that from the family. They did have good memories of their grandfather and of that whole story of what happened in the 30s. They had records of that. I think, like a lot of families, they've paid attention to the Holocaust story and to their own immigration stories. And there were some oral histories that were recorded of the earlier generation. One of whom is one of the great characters in this series was their aunt, who was a teenage girl who was so Josie's
Oh
son,
yeah.
Martin, is the main character, but his sister also left and went to London with
She
her
was
family.
outraged. She was
And she was like,
to
"You
leave.
ruined my life,
Yeah.
tearing me away from my friends." She's a teenage girl, very privileged and
Yes.
just indignant that you're dragging me out of Nazi Germany and it's going to just ruin my
For
whole
social life. Yeah.
You can just see that. It seemed like a character from a Philip Roth novel. I've
Yeah.
never seen that in history.
Speaking of, in part 7, can you read the last couple of paragraphs? And this is basically describing Germany towards the end of the 30s.
Okay. On November 10th, 1938, the world was shocked as the violent anti-Jewish pogrom known as Kristallnacht swept across Germany. The small surviving synagogue in Nuremberg was burned to the ground. For months after, more than half the Jewish deaths in Germany would be suicides. On November 18th, Representative Charles Buckley of New York responded with a public letter calling for the Alaska Territory to be opened to Jewish refugees fleeing the violence. Quote, "I'm sure that these immigrants will build Alaska as this country was built by immigrants who came to the United States from many lands during periods of persecution in the past," the congressman wrote. Buckley's Alaska plan would end up going nowhere. But Josie's Alaska plan worked. The day Buckley released his letter, Josephine Rudolph Thurnauer stepped off a ship in Harwich, England, a U.S. citizen bound for New York.
That's so good. I want to talk about Charles Buckley's plan. I'm just curious if you know how serious that plan was and how long it was discussed or thought about or.
Yeah, I actually wrote an even longer series than this about that plan in 1999 for the Anchorage Daily News. And I think there's some links to that earlier project connected to this story. And Buckley was one of the first to come public with it, but it was generated within the FDR administration and within the Interior Department. There's been a few pieces written about it. Interior did a big study explaining that this would be a way to populate and develop the Alaska Territory by bringing in immigrants and specifically German Jewish refugees. But they expanded it beyond the Jewish refugees and really tried to de-emphasize that in this report, even though that was really the origins of the idea. And there were some hearings in Congress, but it didn't get beyond the committee stage.
Correct me if I'm wrong. It was just such an anti-immigrant sentiment in America. They were allowing so few immigrants in that this was like a workaround to be like, hey, we won't let immigrants into your neighborhood. We'll let them into Alaska, maybe, like as a way of allowing for more immigration without offending the folks who were very xenophobic at the time.
Yeah, the U.S. Holocaust Museum has a terrific traveling exhibit that's been showing at the Seward Library for this past month. Seward was the one location in Alaska that was chosen to show it this year, about the American failure to respond to the Holocaust before it was too late. I was invited to give a talk down there, and so I was able to reprise my earlier story, which was so tragic and poignant because I was able to find letters from families in central Germany that were trying to get to Alaska and were portraying themselves as great potential pioneers. And they had seen this report and were naive about the politics behind it and didn't appreciate the levels of anti-Semitism and practical concerns as well. And these families were full of hope, and they all disappeared in the Holocaust. They never got out. And so I was able to tell that story, but then it was exciting to be able to also tell the story of Josie Rudolph, at the second part of my talk, this pioneer daughter and how in the end she strode off that ship in England as a U.S. citizen heading for America. And so at least her Alaska plan worked where the big Alaska resettlement plan was a big flop.
I couldn't help but think about Vic Fisher when I was reading this section, just because he escaped Stalin's Russia with his brother because they had American passports, even though they never stepped foot because they had an American father and they had their American passports. And I think for so many of us, we hear about German Jewish immigrants and their families. It was actually very difficult for those people to get here. And the stories that I know in my head, Josie and Vic Fisher, they had American passports. That's how they did it, because we weren't allowing a flood of immigrants to come here.
Yeah, and it took Josie a couple of years to get her passport in Germany, even with that affidavit of her birth. It's interesting to reflect back to the origins of her birthright citizenship claim. And it's another one of these themes that was jumping out of this story into the present day. The fact that the 14th Amendment was adopted and ratified in 1868, right before she was born. And that was to give citizenship to all the enslaved people who had been freed. But it also said any child born in the United States is a U.S. citizen. And just a sweeping assertion.
She barely made it. She barely became a U.S. citizen.
Barely, both in the physical placement in Alaska, but also in terms of time. Yeah, that's something that has been argued in the current immigration debate, to take away that right of birthright citizenship for immigrants. And the pros and cons still being kicked around these days, and we may hear more of that.
100%. Hey, to end our interview today, I want you to read from the final part.
Yeah, okay. That's where I was talking about the Tlingit land claims. And even today, on Alaska Day, when they celebrate the raising of the flag in Sitka, there's a counter ceremony that the Tlingit people hold. So many powerful forces of history converging on the outer coast of Baranof Island. The birth of American imperialism, the seizure of ancestral Tlingit lands, the expulsion of European Jews, the failure to open Alaska to refugees from the Nazi. Secretary Seward and his caged eagle, so much for the modern world to regret. But a baby born into a house on Lincoln Street in Sitka was saved from the horrors of Julius Streicher Strasse in Nuremberg.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom Kizzia, for being back on the show, and congratulations on a really terrific series in the ADN.
Thanks for reading it.
I have dropped the link in the show notes for Josie's story, as well as Tom's previous appearances on the podcast. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.